I still remember the exact words that ended my relationship with my son forever. It was March 15th, 2024, at Miguel's birthday dinner in Santa Fe. The dining room sparkled under crystal chandeliers, and 30 guests filled the mahogany table I'd helped him buy 2 years earlier. Miguel stood at the head of that table's champagne glass, raised his success, radiating from every fiber of his designer suit. At 32, he just closed his third major tech deal, and the local business journal had named him one of New Mexico's rising entrepreneurs. I sat there proud, as any mother would be clutching the vintage wine Roberto and I had saved for this exact moment. Then Miguel began his speech. He thanked his investors, his business partners, even his college professors. He spoke passionately about his journey from startup dreams to million-dollar reality. He credited his discipline, his vision, his relentless work ethic. The room hung on every word as he painted himself as the perfect self-made success story. But then his tone shifted. He looked directly at me, and what he said next still echoes in my mind every single day. Miguel told that room full of people that his biggest obstacle hadn't been market competition or funding challenges. No, according to him, his biggest hurdle had been overcoming the limitations of an overprotective mother who constantly tried to shelter him from real-world experiences. He actually said I held him back, that my attempts to help had weakened his resolve, that everything he'd achieved happened not because of family support, but despite it. He claimed that learning to ignore my advice and break free from my hovering had been the key to his success. The guests chuckled appreciatively at his independent story. His wife, Victoria, beamed with pride, and I sat there wine untouched, watching my son erase every sacrifice Roberto and I had ever made for him. What Miguel didn't know as he basked in applause that night was that every single dollar funding his self-made empire had come from one source. The mother he just publicly dismissed as his greatest obstacle had been his greatest asset all along. And sometimes, when someone is so determined to prove they don't need you, the kindest thing you can do is let them find out if that's really true. Have you ever been in a situation where someone took credit for your behind-the-scenes support? Let me know in the comments, because this story is just getting started. For 8 years, I lived as Miguel's silent financial foundation, and I was perfectly content being invisible. It started innocently enough after Roberto passed in 2016. Miguel was 24, fresh out of college, with big dreams and bigger student loans. He had this brilliant idea for restaurant scheduling software, something that could revolutionize how kitchens manage their staff rotations. I believed in him completely. When he needed $15,000 for initial development costs, I wrote the check without hesitation. When his first prototype failed and he needed another $10,000 to pivot the concept, I covered it. Roberto had left us comfortable, and seeing Miguel's passion reminded me so much of his father's determination when he first ran for district judge. The second startup came 18 months later. This time, it was logistics software for small delivery companies. Miguel's presentations were polished, his business plan thorough, but the market timing was wrong. I covered the office lease for 6 months paid for website development and quietly settled with an angry investor when the whole thing collapsed. Miguel never knew about that last part. By his third venture, the pattern was established. He'd call with excitement in his voice, explaining his latest breakthrough. I'd listen for hours as he outlined his vision, then ask how much he needed. Never how he planned to pay it back, never what my return would be, just how much. Because mothers don't invest in their children expecting profit. We invest because love doesn't come with spreadsheets. When Miguel got engaged to Victoria in 2019, I offered to help with their condo down payment. They'd found this gorgeous place in the rail yard district, all exposed brick and mountain views. But the asking price was steep. Miguel proudly told me he'd saved $20,000 toward the purchase. What he didn't know was that I quietly paid the remaining $80,000 in full, letting him believe his contribution was the majority. His pride mattered more to me than credit. Victoria's boutique came next. She had exquisite taste and a sharp eye for fashion, but retail requires serious capital. When she panicked about unexpected renovation costs, I stepped in again. When their wedding expenses spiraled beyond their budget, I covered the difference. When Miguel's current company needed bridge funding, I provided it through a shell corporation so he'd never feel diminished. I kept meticulous records of every transaction, but never with expectation of repayment. These weren't loans in my mind. They were investments in my son's happiness deposits into his future security. I thought I was building his confidence. Instead, I was creating something much more dangerous, the illusion that success comes without sacrifice. Looking back now, I can pinpoint exactly when Miguel's requests transformed from grateful asks into casual expectations. It was subtle at first, the way entitlement always is. Instead of long phone calls explaining his latest venture, the conversations grew shorter, more transactional. Instead of thank you notes, I received brief texts confirming money had arrived. The shift happened around 2021 when Miguel's current company finally started showing real promise. His scheduling platform had evolved into something genuinely innovative, and suddenly he was fielding calls from major restaurant chains. Success was intoxicating, and with it came a dangerous rewriting of history. Miguel began talking about his business journey differently. In interviews with local media, he'd describe his rise as a testament to pure determination and smart decision-making. He'd mention the challenges of bootstrapping, the sleepless nights, the personal sacrifices, but never the phone calls to mom, never the checks that kept his dreams alive during the lean months. Victoria picked up the same tone. When her boutique started thriving, she'd post on social media about being a self-made businesswoman who'd built everything from the ground up. The renovation costs I'd covered became her smart investment strategy. The inventory purchases I'd funded became her savvy market timing. I wasn't erased from their narrative. I simply never existed in it. The requests themselves became more presumptuous too. Miguel stopped saying please and started saying things like, "It would just be easier if you handled this," or "We were hoping you might step in just this once." But it was never just once. When Victoria needed new point-of-sale equipment, when Miguel wanted to upgrade his office space, when they decided to take that expensive anniversary trip to Europe, the assumption was always that I'd say yes, and I always did, because I'd convinced myself that supporting your children's dreams was what good mothers do. Roberto used to joke that I'd give Miguel the shirt off my back if he asked for it. After Roberto died, I think I was trying to give Miguel enough support for both parents. The most painful part wasn't the money. Though the amounts had grown substantial over the years, it was watching my son develop a worldview where his success existed in a vacuum, disconnected from any help or sacrifice from others. He genuinely believed his achievements were purely self-generated, and worse, he was starting to believe that any support I'd provided had actually been counterproductive to his growth. By 2024, Miguel had convinced himself that he would have succeeded faster and bigger if I'd just stayed out of his way entirely. That birthday speech wasn't cruelty. It was his honest perception of our relationship. 3 weeks before that devastating birthday dinner, I found something that changed everything. I was finally cleaning out Roberto's old home office, a task I'd been avoiding for nearly 8 years. His mahogany desk still smelled faintly of his cologne, and every drawer held memories I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That's when I discovered the leather journal tucked behind his law books. Roberto had always been a note-taker, but this wasn't his usual case files or legal research. This was personal dated entries spanning Miguel's teenage years through his early 20s. My husband had been quietly documenting our son's character development, and what I read there stopped me cold. One entry from 2015 particularly haunted me. Roberto had written about Miguel's college graduation party, where our son had spent the entire evening telling guests about his academic achievements, while conveniently forgetting to mention the tutoring we'd paid for the laptop we'd replaced twice, or the rent money we'd sent every month for 4 years. Roberto's words were gentle but precise. Elena sees Miguel's potential and wants to nurture it. I see a young man learning that effort is optional when safety nets are guaranteed. We're raising a son who believes success is his birthright, rather than something earned through genuine struggle. Another passage from 2017 made my hand shake as I read it. Miguel had just launched his first failed startup, and Roberto observed how quickly our son had moved past the disappointment once I covered all his debts. Roberto wrote Miguel experiences failure the way most people experience minor inconvenience. When consequences disappear, that quickly lessons disappear with them. Elena's love is becoming Miguel's greatest disadvantage. The final entry was dated just 2 months before Roberto's death. Miguel had canceled a visit home, claiming work pressures, right after I'd sent him another substantial check. Roberto's handwriting was already growing shaky from his illness, but his words were crystal clear. Our son is developing the emotional muscles of someone who's never truly needed to lift his own weight. Elena gives because she loves him. Miguel takes because he's learned that's how their relationship works. If we're not careful, we'll create a man who confuses unconditional support with unconditional entitlement. At the bottom of that final page, Roberto had added one last observation. The kindest thing Elena could ever do for Miguel might be the hardest thing Elena could ever do for herself. Sometimes, love means allowing someone to discover their own strength, even if it means letting them fall first. I closed that journal and sat in Roberto's chair for hours, finally understanding what my late husband had been trying to tell me for years. Miguel didn't need more support. He needed to learn what life felt like without it. That birthday dinner at Miguel's house should have been a celebration. I'd driven down from Santa Fe with Roberto's 1978 vintage wine, the bottle we'd been saving for exactly this kind of milestone. Miguel's tech company had just landed its biggest contract yet, and at 32, he was finally achieving the success we'd always dreamed of for him. The dining room gleamed with expensive taste. Crystal glasses, fresh orchids, 30 guests from Santa Fe's business elite. I sat quietly near the middle of the table, watching Miguel work the room with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in it. Victoria looked stunning in emerald silk, playing the perfect entrepreneur's wife. When Miguel stood to give his toast, the room fell silent with anticipation. He spoke eloquently about his journey, his voice strong and practiced from countless investor presentations. He thanked his team, his mentors, even his college professors. He painted a vivid picture of late nights, difficult decisions, and the courage to take risks when others played it safe. Then he shifted to more personal territory, and I felt a familiar warmth spreading through my chest. Surely, now he'd acknowledged the foundation Roberto and I had provided, the safety net that had allowed him to take those risks he was so proud of. Instead, Miguel looked directly at me and said something that felt like a physical blow. He told that room full of influential people that his biggest challenge hadn't been market competition or funding obstacles. His biggest challenge, he explained with a slight smile, had been learning to overcome the limitations of an overprotective mother who consistently tried to shield him from real-world experiences. The words hung in the air like smoke. Miguel continued explaining how he'd had to actively resist my tendency to solve his problems for him, how my well-meaning interference had actually slowed his development as an independent businessman, how his real growth had begun when he'd learned to politely ignore my advice and trust his own instincts instead. The guests nodded approvingly at this tale of healthy separation and self-reliance. Victoria beamed with pride at her self-made husband. And I sat there, Roberto's wine growing warm in my hands, watching our son transform 8 years of financial support into 8 years of maternal hindrance. Miguel raised his glass in a final toast to self-determination and the courage to forge your own path. 30 people applauded his independence, and something inside me, something that had been bending for years under the weight of unacknowledged sacrifice, finally snapped clean in half. Sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us the deepest often, without even realizing it. Have you experienced something similar? Share your story below. I left Miguel's party that night without saying goodbye to anyone, while the guests continued celebrating my son's self-made success. I drove home through the dark New Mexico landscape, Roberto's unopened wine still sitting on my passenger seat like a silent witness to everything that had just unfolded. Back in my adobe house in the hills above Santa Fe, I sat at the kitchen table where Roberto and I used to plan our finances every Sunday morning. The silence felt different that night, heavier somehow, like the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I poured myself a glass of water and stared at the stack of mail I'd been ignoring, bills and bank statements that suddenly seemed to hold new significance. That's when I remembered the filing cabinet in Roberto's old office. Not the sentimental items I'd been sorting through, but the practical documents we'd organized together during his final months. Roberto had insisted on reviewing every legal arrangement we'd made for Miguel's benefit, making sure I understood the full scope of what we'd put in place. I pulled out the thick manila folder labeled Miguel Financial Arrangements and spread the contents across the dining room table. What I saw there made my breath catch. Over the years, Roberto and I hadn't just been writing checks to help our son. We'd been systematically creating a financial infrastructure that supported his entire adult life. The condo he was so proud of, the deed, showed a complex trust arrangement where I maintained controlling interest, while Miguel believed he owned it outright. His business accounts were linked to credit lines I'd personally guaranteed. Even his company's corporate structure flowed through legal entities Roberto had established, making me the ultimate decision-maker on virtually every major asset Miguel considered his own. Roberto had designed it this way deliberately. He'd explained during one of our final conversations. He wanted Miguel to feel independent and confident, but he also wanted to ensure I could protect our family's financial legacy if circumstances changed. At the time, I'd thought it was just Roberto being cautious about estate planning. Now I realized it was something else entirely. Roberto had been building me an exit strategy. For 8 years, I'd been Miguel's silent partner, invisible investor, and unofficial guarantor. But I'd also been retaining legal control over everything I'd helped create. Miguel's self-made empire wasn't just built on my money, it was still essentially owned by me. And for the first time since that humiliating dinner speech, I felt something other than heartbreak. I felt power. The next morning, I called my attorney before sunrise. Marcus Delgado had been Roberto's law partner for 20 years, and he knew every detail of our family's financial arrangements. When I explained what I wanted to do, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus, I said quietly. I need to understand exactly what control I have over Miguel's assets. And I need to know how to exercise that control without warning. The meeting took place that afternoon in Marcus's downtown Santa Fe office. He spread the documents across his conference table like a surgeon laying out instruments. The trust structures Roberto had created were more sophisticated than I'd remembered. Every major asset in Miguel's life flowed through legal entities where I held final authority. The most shocking revelation was Miguel's business itself. The incorporation papers showed that while Miguel owned 60% of his tech company outright, the remaining 40% belonged to a holding company called Vasquez Family Enterprises. I was the sole decision maker for that entity, which meant I could effectively control any major business decision Miguel tried to make. Marcus explained the process step by step. First, I could freeze the credit lines that backed Miguel's business operations. Second, I could demand immediate repayment of all outstanding loans, which would trigger default clauses in his corporate agreements. Third, I could exercise my ownership rights to force a sale of assets or restructure the company entirely. But there was an even more nuclear option. The trust that held Miguel's condo included a clause Roberto had insisted on, something about protecting family assets from potential legal liability. If I declared the trust compromised due to misrepresentation or breach of fiduciary duty, I could essentially reclaim everything. Marcus looked uncomfortable as he explained this final option. Elena, he said carefully, Roberto designed these protections because he was worried about Miguel making poor decisions under pressure, but using them this way because of hurt feelings over a speech. I stopped him there. This isn't about hurt feelings, Marcus. This is about truth. Miguel just spent an evening telling 30 people that his success came despite my interference, not because of my support. If that's really what he believes, then he should have the chance to prove it. I signed the preliminary paperwork that afternoon. The process would take 72 hours to complete, during which Miguel would have no warning that his financial foundation was being systematically dismantled. By the time he realized what was happening, every safety net I'd ever provided would already be gone. For the first time in 8 years, Miguel was about to discover what his success looked like without his mother's invisible hand holding it up. While Marcus processed the legal paperwork, I began planning my own disappearance. If Miguel truly believed he was better off without my involvement, then I would give him exactly what he'd asked for. But I wasn't going to sit in Santa Fe watching the aftermath unfold. I was going to start over completely. I'd always loved the Oregon coast. Roberto and I had honeymooned in Cannon Beach 45 years earlier, and we talked about retiring somewhere near the ocean once his judicial career ended. Now seemed like the perfect time to honor that old dream, even if I'd be doing it alone. The practical arrangements were surprisingly straightforward. I opened new bank accounts under the name Elena Cortez, using my grandmother's maiden name and my own middle name. Marcus helped me establish this identity legally through a simple name change petition, something I could do as a widow, reorganizing her affairs. Within 2 weeks, Elena Vasquez had quietly become Elena Cortez. I found a furnished rental in Lincoln City. Through an online search, a small oceanfront condo that came with everything I'd need for an extended stay. The owner was an elderly woman who'd moved to assisted living and was happy to have a responsible tenant for the winter months. I sent the deposit and signed a 6-month lease without ever visiting in person. Packing was the hardest part. I took only what would fit in my Honda Pilot clothes for all seasons: Roberto's watch and wedding ring, a few photographs and the financial documents that proved what I'd really contributed to Miguel's success. Everything else I left behind. The furniture Roberto and I had chosen together, the artwork we'd collected during our travels, even my grandmother's china. Let Miguel inherit it all if he wanted. I was traveling light now. The drive to Oregon took 2 days, and I stopped overnight in Denver rather than rushing. There was something liberating about checking into a roadside motel under my new name, eating dinner alone at a truck stop diner where nobody knew my history. For the first time in 8 years, I wasn't Elena the mother, Elena the financial safety net, Elena the invisible supporter. I was just Elena, driving toward the ocean with no agenda beyond starting fresh. When I finally reached Lincoln City and saw the Pacific stretching endlessly toward the horizon, I understood what Roberto had meant when he talked about the coast. The ocean doesn't care about your past mistakes or your family disappointments. It just keeps moving, constant and clean, washing everything smooth again. I was ready to be washed smooth too. Miguel's world started collapsing on a Tuesday morning, exactly 72 hours after I'd signed the paperwork in Marcus's office. I was 300 miles away in Lincoln City, drinking coffee on my rented balcony and watching fishing boats navigate the early morning swells when the first domino fell. It started with Victoria's credit card being declined at her boutique's wholesale supplier. She tried it twice, then called the bank from her car, certain there'd been some kind of computer error. The customer service representative was polite but firm. The account had been frozen due to irregular activity, and she'd need to visit a branch location with proper identification to resolve the issue. Victoria drove straight home and found Miguel in his office focused on quarterly projections for his tech company. She tossed the rejected card on his desk and explained what had happened. Miguel shrugged it off, initially suggesting she call a different bank representative or try again later. Credit card companies made mistakes all the time, but when Miguel tried to access his own business accounts later that afternoon, he encountered the same problem. His primary checking account was frozen. His business credit line was suspended. The automated system kept directing him to speak with a specialist, and the specialist kept putting him on hold. By evening, they were both in full panic mode. Miguel spent hours on the phone with various financial institutions, trying to understand what had triggered this sudden coordination of freezes across multiple accounts. The explanations were vague and bureaucratic: routine security reviews, updated risk assessments, standard procedures for high-value accounts. What the bank representatives couldn't tell Miguel, because they didn't fully understand it themselves, was that every one of these accounts was connected to legal entities controlled by Elena Vasquez. When I'd instructed Marcus to begin the dissolution process, it had triggered automatic reviews across every financial institution where my name appeared as a guarantor or controlling party. Thursday morning brought worse news. Miguel's business landlord called to inform him that the automatic rent payment had bounced. The accountant who managed his corporate taxes left a concerned voicemail about irregularities in the company's banking relationships. 2 of Miguel's employees asked privately whether there were financial problems they should be worried about. By Friday, Miguel was desperate enough to call me directly. My phone rang while I was walking along the beach, collecting shells and breathing salt air. I looked at his name on the screen and felt something I'd never experienced before. When my son called complete indifference, I let it go to voicemail and continued walking. The ocean was much more interesting than whatever crisis Miguel was finally discovering. Victoria discovered the full scope of their financial collapse on a Saturday morning, and by Sunday evening, she was gone. I learned this not from Miguel, who still hadn't reached me, but from Marcus, who called to update me on the legal proceedings. Apparently, Victoria had spent Saturday making phone calls of her own. Unlike Miguel, who'd been content to wait for bank representatives to resolve what he assumed were temporary glitches, Victoria had demanded immediate answers. She'd driven to 3 different bank branches, armed with account numbers and legal documents, determined to understand why their entire financial infrastructure had suddenly evaporated. The truth, when it finally emerged, was devastating. Victoria learned that the boutique she'd considered her independent business achievement was actually funded through credit lines guaranteed by Miguel's mother. The inventory she'd bought, the renovations she'd supervised, even the point-of-sale system she'd selected, had all been purchased with money that could be recalled at any time by someone who wasn't her husband. Worse, the condo they'd lived in for 5 years wasn't actually theirs. Victoria had always believed Miguel owned it outright, a symbol of his business success and financial responsibility. Instead, she discovered that the property was held in a complex trust arrangement where Elena Vasquez maintained controlling interest. They'd been living in what amounted to an elaborate rental agreement disguised as ownership. Miguel tried to explain the situation to Victoria that Saturday night, but his explanations only made things worse. He admitted that his mother had helped with various business expenses over the years, but he insisted he'd had no idea about the legal structures that gave her so much control. He promised he could fix everything, that this was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved with the right lawyers and some difficult conversations. Victoria listened to all of this with the calculating expression of someone reassessing a major life decision. She'd married a successful entrepreneur, not a man whose entire adult life was financially dependent on his mother's continued goodwill. She'd built her identity around being a self-made businesswoman, not someone whose achievements existed only because of another woman's generosity. Marcus told me that Victoria had left a brief note for Miguel, something about needing time to think and staying with her sister in Albuquerque. But her real message was delivered through her actions. By Monday morning, she contacted a divorce attorney and begun the process of legally separating herself from Miguel's sinking financial ship. She'd recognized something Miguel still couldn't see. When someone's success is built on invisible support, the collapse is just as invisible until it's already complete. Have you ever realized that something you thought was solid was actually more fragile than you knew? Let me know in the comments. I never intended for Miguel's story to become public, but sometimes the truth has its own momentum. It started with a phone call I made on a quiet Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Victoria had left, and Miguel's frantic voicemails had finally stopped coming. Years earlier, I'd helped a young journalist named Sarah Chen fight a legal battle over housing discrimination. She'd been investigating landlords who were illegally denying apartments to single mothers, and when one of them tried to silence her with frivolous lawsuits, I'd provided pro bono legal advice that helped her win the case. Sarah had sent me a heartfelt thank you note, promising that if I ever needed a story told, she'd be listening. I found her email address and sent a simple message. I think I have something that might interest you. A story about hidden family money in New Mexico's tech scene. Sarah drove up to Lincoln City the following weekend, and we sat in my rented condo overlooking the Pacific while I showed her 8 years of financial records. Bank transfers, loan documents, corporate filings, all meticulously organized in the accordion folder I'd brought from Santa Fe. Sarah studied every page with the focused intensity of someone who recognized a significant story when she saw one. The article she published 3 weeks later was titled "The Invisible Investors: How Family Money Props Up New Mexico's Self-Made Success Stories." Sarah never mentioned Miguel by name, but she didn't need to. Anyone in Santa Fe's business community would recognize the details: the young tech entrepreneur, the restaurant scheduling software, the recent major contract that had made him a local celebrity. The piece was devastating in its precision. Sarah had traced the money flows through public records, documenting how a supposedly bootstrapped startup had actually been funded through a complex web of family trusts and guaranteed credit lines. She'd interviewed other business owners who suspected similar arrangements in their own industries, creating a broader narrative about the myth of self-made success. The most damaging section focused on the disconnect between public statements and private reality. Sarah quoted extensively from Miguel's recent interviews and social media posts, where he described his journey as a testament to personal determination and smart risk-taking. She then contrasted those quotes with the financial documents showing massive family support at every critical juncture. The article went viral within hours of publication. Local business networks shared it widely, and soon Miguel's name was being whispered in every Santa Fe conference room and country club. The self-made entrepreneur had become the poster child for privileged entrepreneurs who'd forgotten their privilege. From my oceanfront balcony, I watched the waves roll in and felt something I hadn't expected: peace. The article's publication triggered something desperate in Miguel that I witnessed only through secondhand reports from Marcus and a few mutual friends in Santa Fe. My son, who had always prided himself on his composure and business acumen, was unraveling in increasingly public ways. It started with phone calls to everyone who might know where I'd gone. Miguel contacted my old neighbors, my former colleagues from the law firm, even the landscaper who'd maintained our property for 15 years. He offered no explanations for my sudden disappearance, just urgent questions about whether anyone had heard from me or knew how to reach me. When those inquiries yielded nothing, Miguel hired a private investigator. Marcus learned this from a colleague who'd been approached about my recent legal activities. The investigator was thorough, tracing my last known financial transactions and even checking airline records for travel under my name. But Elena Vasquez had simply vanished, leaving no trail for them to follow. Miguel's business began suffering from his distraction. The tech company that had been his pride and joy started missing deadlines as he spent entire days trying to reconstruct the financial arrangements his mother had dismantled. Employees whispered about their founder's erratic behavior, the way he'd disappear for hours to make phone calls or drive aimlessly around Santa Fe looking for clues to my whereabouts. The most painful detail came from my old neighbor Maria, who called to tell me about Miguel's visit to our family home. He'd shown up on a Thursday evening using the spare key we'd always kept hidden under the ceramic coyote near the front door. Maria had watched from her kitchen window as Miguel walked through every room, turning on lights and searching through closets, like he might find me hiding somewhere in the shadows. He'd sat on the front porch for nearly 2 hours that night. Maria told me, just staring at the street, like he expected me to drive up any moment. When he finally left, she'd seen him crying behind the wheel of his car, something she'd never witnessed even during his father's funeral. The desperate searching continued for months. Miguel placed missing person inquiries with local police, though they quickly determined I'd left voluntarily and wasn't in danger. He even hired a second investigator when the first one failed to produce results. What Miguel couldn't understand, what drove him to these increasingly frantic measures, was that I wasn't hiding from him. I was simply living a life that didn't include him. For the first time in 32 years, I was Elena Cortez, not Miguel's mother, and that distinction was apparently impossible for him to comprehend. The federal investigation began 4 months after the article's publication, and I learned about it through a certified letter forwarded from my old Santa Fe address. The Internal Revenue Service had questions about the complex financial arrangements between various family trusts and Miguel's business entities arrangements that had suddenly become much more visible thanks to Sarah Chen's reporting. Marcus called me that same afternoon, his voice tight with concern. "Elena," he said, "we need to talk about the federal inquiry. They're looking specifically at the trust structures Roberto designed, and they want to understand why so many business assets were transferred so quickly." I drove back to Santa Fe for the first time in months, staying in a hotel downtown rather than returning to my old house. The meeting with the IRS investigators took place in Marcus's conference room on a gray Tuesday morning, and I answered their questions with the calm precision of someone who'd spent decades managing legal documentation. The investigators were thorough, but not hostile. They wanted to understand whether Miguel had properly reported the family financial support on his business tax returns. They questioned whether the trust arrangements constituted legitimate estate planning or were designed to hide income and assets from proper taxation. Most significantly, they were examining whether Miguel's public claims of being self-funded might constitute fraud in his applications for business loans and investor agreements. The irony wasn't lost on me. Miguel's insistence that he'd succeeded without family help had created a paper trail that directly contradicted 8 years of substantial financial transfers. Every interview where he'd claimed to be bootstrapped, every loan application where he'd understated his family connections, every investor presentation where he'd painted himself as independently funded now looked like potential evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. I provided the investigators with complete financial records, every document Roberto and I had carefully maintained over the years. The trust structures were entirely legal, I explained. The financial transfers had been properly documented. If Miguel had failed to report the support accurately on his business filings, that was his choice, not my requirement. The most devastating revelation came when they showed me Miguel's recent loan applications. Even after I'd withdrawn my financial backing, even as his world was collapsing around him, Miguel had continued listing family assets as collateral for new business credit. He was still trying to leverage support that no longer existed, still operating under the assumption that my money would always be available when he needed it. The investigators thanked me for my cooperation and assured me I wasn't under suspicion. The focus of their inquiry was Miguel's representations, not my family's legal financial planning. The legal documents arrived at Miguel's office on a Thursday morning in October, delivered by certified courier in a thick manila envelope marked Urgent Legal Notice. His assistant brought them directly to his desk, where Miguel was struggling through another day of trying to salvage his collapsing business empire. Inside the envelope was a formal notice from Marcus's law firm, along with copies of trust documents that Miguel had never seen before. The cover letter was brief and devastating. Per the terms of the Vasquez Family Trust, established 2016, please be advised that all assets previously held for your benefit have been transferred to alternative beneficiaries, effective immediately. Miguel read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Then he began examining the attached documents, each page revealing another layer of financial reality he'd never understood. The condo he'd believed he owned outright had always belonged to a family trust. The business credit lines he'd relied on had been personally guaranteed by his mother through corporate entities she controlled. Even his company's office lease had been secured using family assets as collateral. But the most shocking revelation was buried in the original trust language Roberto had drafted 8 years earlier. The trust had always included specific clauses about breach of family dignity and public misrepresentation of family support. If the beneficiary ever publicly denied or minimized family financial contributions, the trustee had complete discretion to reallocate all assets to other purposes. Miguel's birthday speech, where he dismissed his mother's role and claimed her support had actually hindered his success, constituted exactly the kind of breach Roberto had anticipated. The legal language was precise and unforgiving. Any beneficiary who publicly characterized family support as interference or obstruction would forfeit all trust benefits permanently. The final page contained the most devastating detail of all. Every asset previously held for Miguel's benefit had been transferred to a new entity, the Roberto Vasquez Memorial Scholarship Fund, dedicated to supporting students studying ethical business practices and family financial planning. The fund would be administered by an anonymous donor, with Marcus serving as the legal representative. Miguel called Marcus immediately, but the conversation was brief and professional. Marcus confirmed that all transfers had been completed according to the original trust terms. No appeals would be considered. No reversals were possible. The scholarship fund was now fully endowed and operational, accepting its first applications for the coming academic year. Miguel hung up the phone and sat in his office, surrounded by the remnants of a business built on financial foundations that had never actually belonged to him. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly alone with his self-made success. The scholarship announcement appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican on a crisp November morning, a small but significant notice in the education section that few people would have noticed if not for recent events. The Roberto Vasquez Memorial Scholarship Fund announces its inaugural program supporting students pursuing degrees in ethical business practices and family financial literacy. I read the announcement from my kitchen table in Lincoln City, sipping coffee and watching seabirds navigate the morning surf. Marcus had handled everything exactly as we discussed, creating a lasting tribute to Roberto's values, while ensuring that the money I'd invested in Miguel's illusions would now serve a more worthy purpose. The scholarship criteria were specific and pointed. Recipients would be required to complete coursework in family financial planning, ethical business relationships, and the social responsibilities of entrepreneurship. They'd write essays about gratitude, acknowledgement of support systems, and the difference between independence and self-delusion. Each scholar would receive enough funding to complete their education without family financial assistance, learning to succeed through their own efforts rather than invisible safety nets. Marcus called that afternoon to confirm that the final legal transfers had been completed. Miguel's business accounts had been closed, his remaining corporate assets liquidated, and his office lease terminated. The tech company that had been his pride and joy was officially dissolved, its contracts and intellectual property sold to competitors who'd been circling like vultures since the financial troubles began. More significantly, Miguel's personal assets had been reduced to exactly what he claimed to have achieved on his own nothing. The condo was gone, sold to pay outstanding debts. The car he'd purchased with family-backed credit had been repossessed. Even his business wardrobe, purchased with credit cards, guaranteed by family trusts, had been claimed by creditors. Miguel was now free to discover what his self-made success actually looked like without any family interference whatsoever. The most satisfying detail came from Maria, my old neighbor, who'd seen Miguel packing his remaining belongings into a borrowed pickup truck. He'd taken only what could fit in a few cardboard boxes, some clothes, a laptop, and a single framed photograph of him receiving a business award the previous year. Victoria had already filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences in financial misrepresentation. The settlement was simple, since there were no longer any assets to divide. Miguel had finally achieved what he'd always claimed to want: complete independence from his mother's involvement in his life. The only difference was that it looked nothing like the success story he'd imagined it would be. The first Roberto Vasquez Memorial Scholar was announced in January 2025, and reading about her brought me more joy than any financial statement ever had. Maria Elena Santos was a 22-year-old from Las Cruces, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night to pay for her daughter's community college tuition. Maria Elena's application essay had moved the selection committee to tears. She wrote about watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat and how that experience had taught her that real success meant honoring the people who made your dreams possible. Her proposed thesis project focused on developing financial literacy programs for immigrant families, helping them navigate complex banking systems and avoid predatory lending practices. Unlike Miguel Maria Elena, understood that acknowledging support didn't diminish personal achievement. It elevated it. Her essay concluded with a promise that would have made Roberto proud. If I'm successful in business, it will be because my mother showed me that strength comes from lifting others up, not from pretending you climbed alone. The scholarship provided full tuition for Maria Elena's final 2 years at New Mexico State University, plus funding for her graduate studies in business ethics. But more importantly, it connected her with a network of mentors who understood the difference between enabling dependence and providing genuine support. Marcus sent me photos from the scholarship presentation ceremony. Maria Elena stood at the podium in the university's business school, flanked by professors and community leaders speaking about her commitment to ethical entrepreneurship and family financial responsibility. Her mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, wearing the kind of proud expression I'd once hoped to see in Miguel's eyes when he looked at me. The scholarship fund had grown beyond my initial endowment, thanks to donations from other families who'd read Sarah Chen's article and recognized similar dynamics in their own lives. Parents who'd been funding adult children's lifestyles without acknowledgement. Grandparents who'd been taken for granted by successful grandchildren. Spouses who'd provided invisible financial support for partners who claimed all the credit. The fund now supports 6 students annually, each one selected not just for academic merit, but for demonstrated understanding of gratitude, family responsibility, and ethical business practices. They study case studies that include analyses of family financial relationships, learning to recognize the difference between healthy support and enabling dysfunction. Roberto would have loved seeing his name associated with students who understood what Miguel never could, that acknowledging the people who help you succeed doesn't make you weaker. It makes you human. Every scholarship recipient learns what my son never did. Success, built on truth, lasts longer than success built on illusion. Exactly 1 year after that devastating birthday dinner, Miguel stood in front of a weathered headstone in a small cemetery outside Albuquerque. The granite marker was simple and unadorned: Elena Cortez, 1956 to 2024. Beloved by few, forgotten by many. She lived her own truth. He'd driven 3 hours to get there, following a lead from the private investigator he'd never stopped paying. The investigator had traced some financial records to the name Elena Cortez and discovered this burial site purchased and paid for 6 months earlier. Miguel had arrived with flowers and an apology speech he'd been rehearsing for months. But as he stood there reading that cold, unfamiliar inscription, something inside him began to crumble. This wasn't his mother's grave. Elena Vasquez had never become Elena Cortez through marriage or any life change he knew about. This was someone else entirely a stranger, whose death had nothing to do with his family's story. The investigator had been grasping at straws, following false leads, because the real Elena Vasquez had simply vanished without leaving any trace to follow. Miguel had spent a fortune chasing shadows, hiring multiple investigators, placing missing person ads, even consulting psychics, in his desperation to find some path back to the mother he'd lost. Standing in that empty cemetery, surrounded by graves of people he'd never known, Miguel finally understood something that should have been obvious months earlier. His mother hadn't died. She'd done something far more deliberate and devastating. She'd chosen to live a life that didn't include him. The funeral flowers he'd brought felt ridiculous in his hands. Now, a bouquet of apologies for a woman who wasn't dead, wasn't missing, and apparently didn't want to be found. Miguel placed them on the stranger's grave anyway because throwing them away felt too much like giving up entirely. He sat on a concrete bench near the cemetery entrance and pulled out his phone, scrolling through the contacts list he'd been calling obsessively for months. His mother's number was still there, still going straight to a voicemail message that said this number was no longer in service. Victoria's number had been blocked months ago. Even Marcus, his parents' old attorney, now refused to take his calls. For the first time since this nightmare began, Miguel forced himself to confront an unbearable possibility. Maybe his mother wasn't hiding from him. Maybe she'd simply moved on to a life where he no longer existed. Maybe that birthday speech hadn't just hurt her feelings. Maybe it had finally convinced her to take him at his word. Miguel spent another hour in that cemetery, walking among headstones and reading the names of strangers, as if one of them might somehow transform into his mother's final resting place. But reality doesn't bend to desperate wishes, and eventually he had to accept that this latest lead had been as empty as all the others. The drive back to Santa Fe gave him 3 hours to think about the year that had just passed, and every mile of highway seemed to hammer home another painful truth. His tech company was gone, dissolved after months of failed attempts to secure new funding without family backing. His marriage was over-finalized in a divorce settlement that had taken less time than most business meetings. His reputation in Santa Fe's business community was permanently damaged, his name now synonymous with privilege disguised as self-reliance. But perhaps most devastating of all was the slow realization that his mother's disappearance wasn't the cruel punishment he'd initially believed it to be. It was exactly what he'd asked for on his birthday, when he dismissed her support as interference and claimed he would have succeeded faster without her involvement. Miguel pulled into a roadside diner outside Espanola and sat in a corner booth staring at a cup of coffee he didn't want while trying to make sense of the past year. He'd lost everything, but the loss felt different than business failure or divorce or even public humiliation. Those were things that happened to you. This felt like something he'd chosen, even though the choosing had been unconscious at the time. His phone buzzed with a text from his landlord about overdue rent on the studio apartment he'd moved into after losing the condo. Miguel looked at the message and felt nothing but exhaustion. For months, he'd been telling himself this was all temporary, that once he found his mother and apologized properly, everything could be rebuilt. Now he was beginning to understand that some bridges once burned leave no foundation for rebuilding. Some words once spoken cannot be unsaid. Some relationships once severed cannot be mended simply because one party finally realizes what they've lost. Miguel paid for his untouched coffee and walked back to his car carrying the funeral flowers that belonged to no one he knew. The cemetery had taught him something he'd been refusing to learn for months. His mother wasn't dead, but the relationship they'd once shared was buried so completely that not even the most expensive investigator would ever find it again. The road back to Santa Fe stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving as the truth he was finally ready to face. While Miguel was searching empty cemeteries for a ghost, I was very much alive walking the tide pools of Lincoln City on a foggy Tuesday morning. The Pacific had become my daily companion, its rhythms more reliable than any relationship I'd ever known. High tide, low tide, the endless cycle of waves that washed the beach clean twice every day, leaving no trace of yesterday's footprints. I'd been Elena Cortez for over a year now, and the transformation felt more complete with each passing season. The rental condo had become my permanent home after I'd convinced the elderly owner to sell it to me at a fair price. I'd furnished it simply but comfortably, choosing pieces that reflected my taste rather than accommodating family visits that would never come. My days had settled into a peaceful routine that would have seemed impossible during my years as Miguel's invisible bank. Morning walks on the beach afternoons, reading in the cafe near the harbor evenings, writing in the journal I'd started keeping after Roberto's death. For the first time in decades, my schedule belonged entirely to me. The local community had welcomed Elena Cortez warmly, though they knew nothing about Elena Vasquez's complicated history. I joined a book club that met monthly in the library basement, started volunteering at the food bank on weekends, and even taken up watercolor painting at the community center. These people knew me as a retired widow who'd moved to the coast for the peace and beauty, which was perfectly true as far as it went. Sometimes, walking past the gallery windows downtown, I'd catch sight of my reflection and feel surprised by what I saw. The woman looking back at me appeared younger somehow. Despite the year of grief and difficult decisions, the constant tension I'd carried in my shoulders had melted away. The worry lines around my eyes had softened. I looked like someone who slept well at night. The most remarkable change was the absence of my phone anxiety. For 8 years, every call from Miguel had triggered a familiar flutter of concern. What crisis needed managing? What financial emergency required my immediate attention? Now my phone rang rarely. And when it did, it was usually Sarah from book club asking if I wanted to carpool to the monthly meeting, or my neighbor Tom wondering if I'd like to share expenses for a grocery delivery. I'd learned something profound about the difference between being needed and being used. Real relationships don't require you to make yourself smaller, so others can feel larger. Love doesn't demand invisibility as proof of devotion. By the ocean, I'd finally found my true reflection. As I finished telling you this story, sitting here in my Lincoln City home with the sound of waves providing their eternal soundtrack, I want you to understand something important. This isn't a tale of revenge or cruelty. This is a story about boundaries, about the difference between love and enabling, and about what happens when someone finally decides to stop being invisible. For 8 years, I convinced myself that supporting Miguel financially was the same as supporting him emotionally. I thought that solving his problems was how mothers showed love. But Roberto's journal taught me something I should have recognized much earlier. When you consistently remove consequences from someone's choices, you're not helping them grow. You're helping them remain a child. Miguel's birthday speech wasn't the moment our relationship ended. It was the moment I finally heard the truth about how our relationship had been functioning all along. He genuinely believed his success was self-generated because I'd worked so hard to make my support invisible. I'd been so focused on protecting his pride that I'd accidentally taught him to take credit for my sacrifices. The hardest part wasn't cutting off the money or disappearing from Santa Fe. The hardest part was accepting that love sometimes means allowing people to experience the full weight of their own choices, even when those choices lead to painful consequences. I think about Miguel sometimes, usually when I'm walking the beach at sunset, and my mind grows quiet enough to wonder how he's rebuilding his life. I hope he's learned to ask for help honestly, instead of taking it silently. I hope he's discovered the difference between independence and isolation. I hope he's found the kind of success that doesn't require anyone else to remain invisible. But I don't wonder enough to break the boundary I've created. Some relationships can only be healed by complete separation, and some forms of love can only be expressed through letting go entirely. If you're listening to this story and recognizing patterns in your own life, whether you're the invisible supporter or the unconscious taker, I want you to know that change is possible at any age. I was 68 when I finally learned to say no. Roberto was gone. Miguel was lost to his own illusions, But I was still here, still capable of writing a completely different ending to my story. What about you? Have you ever been the invisible support in someone else's success story? Or maybe you've realized that your achievements rested on unacknowledged help from others. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your authentic voice, even when it means disappointing the people you love most. Remember, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop saving them from themselves.